Okay, so let's talk a little bit about social aspects for our second uh, virtual case study client, Glenn. And as you've already read and seen, um, this seemed like a good opportunity to where we could examine sort of where the micro hits the or the macro hits the micro, and so I thought this particular case, albeit fictional, reflects things that are happening uh, uh, for real in that part of the world, and like I said, a good way to sort of examine not just how to examine the social aspects and social determinants and cultural policy aspects. As they relate to a client, but where the macro hits the micro, where they intersect, so to speak. Um, Starting with the micro, we want to get some more clarity on Glenn's support. One of the things that's not mentioned in the clip that we have is Glenn's mother. Is she still present in his life? Is she still living? And if she is, are they connected, estranged, that kind of thing? And any other additional supports. Asking a little bit more about his friend groups and friends who may be more sober supports, or even um, asking him about his thoughts on maybe some of his friends and maybe even his whole friend group would be open to reducing alcohol intake to make or actually having some social engagement without any alcohol to help Glenn um, with his grief and help him process it. So, it's hard to know, and a lot of times that's for clients that just doesn't work. But it certainly is worthy of a conversation. The other thing is that the local boxing and being involved in the boxing, although if he has thoughts of violence or sort of a lot of anger, one might think that boxing might not be the best choice for him. And it possibly, there could possibly be some aspects of it that maybe would be at least worth a conversation about being, in terms of, hey, you don't want to take your boxing skills out and, into the community in a way that's going to cause you trouble and cause other people harm and ultimately yourself harm. But it often doesn't is not that way at all. Like, these kind of things can be an outlet for them to. There are many people who have taken up to hitting a heavy bag or some kind of physical activity regimen like that, where they're dealing with trauma, grief, and they find it very therapeutic. So, and then there's a social aspect to being involved in this local boxing gym as a way to be involved with other people, local community, people doing things, involved in physical activity and camaraderie, could be a real asset to Glenn. So anyway, regarding the how the news piece might relate to that news piece on the macro circumstances around the Aboriginal people, um, and how that might be immediately relevant to Glenn and his situation, is that even though we don't know what happened, right? We weren't there. We don't, potentially we could ascertain additional detail about the circumstances of father's death. Oftentimes not. So we don't know exactly what happened, but what we do know is that Glenn's perception that these macro level issues of racism had an impact on his and maybe even contributed to his father's passing. And that creates, whether that really happened or not, the perception that happened will make that grief a lot, that grief journey, if you will, a lot more challenging because of the complexities of, feeling like there's other circumstances that his father's passing could have been prevented. Um, Certainly, minimizing his alcohol use. Unfortunately, alcohol, though may bring some temporary relief, can be very much like alcohol in a fire with grief. True also with trauma recovery and depression and those almost anything that we talk about from the DSM. But in Glenn's case, The more anything we can do to help him, motivate him to minimize the amount of alcohol use, I think will be helpful in his grief journey, and also uh, mitigating the risk of him running into circumstances, out in the community where he hurts someone else, gets himself hurt, gets in some kind of legal trouble, or all the above. Um, the other thing, but also taking in mind that we're hearing a story, and without getting into I know how you feel, even if we might have had an experience very similar to that, but really just like hearing a story and like absolutely like that contributes, that complicates your grief and maybe sharpens the pain of grief. And so we're here to help you through that, and as best we can. And finally, one thing, and I think this might be sort of longer term, intervention planning. But for some people, and certainly not everybody, but for some people in Glenn's circumstance, part of that healing journey, maybe down the road, is getting involved in community advocacy around a particular topic that uh, might have impacted their lives in a negative way. So certainly, as I'm sure you know, many people who are advocates and dedicated advocates and have done great work are often, their story comes from a place of loss or pain, or um, being being on the receiving end of what they're advocating for, or advocating against, as it were. So anyway, just those are some thoughts around the macro intersecting with the micro with Glenn, and some general thoughts about things you could consider in terms of social, cultural, social determinants, and policy aspects of Glenn and his circumstances and clinical picture.